All right, so like practice run is gonna be like, remember, it's not like it's not like clap and say I'm sorry. Like so it's not like that. It's bang, say it. All right, there you go. You ready?
Well, bang point. Wait, the practice.
No, this is the actual run. This is live now that we're going.
Wait, what is it? Seminar? No.
No, well, not you're the next one. All right, so anyway, there you go. All right, go.
Okay, ready?
Rona, really? You're just coughing it really right at me. Like,
Put your mask on.
oh my God, cover your face. Like, no. All right, go ahead. All right, 1, 2, 3.
Welcome back, AP!
There you go. Very nice. Thank you, girls. Thank you. All right. And if it doesn't record again, I'm just quitting. All right. Crack my door and go interview Miss Rolly, but be right back, okay?
Okay.
All right. So anyway, check this out. Anyway, so all right. Welcome back, AP, again. We left off in class talking about Henry VIII, right? Now, remember in class that we had to disseminate kind of like Henry's rise, because we are mainly talking about Henry VIII in the context of the Reformation, right? We're mainly talking about him as it pertains to the growth of the Reformation, it expanding across the English Channel and going on to non-continental areas of Europe, right? We're now getting also into the idea of the Tudor Dynasty, right? Of course, the Tudor Dynasty being the offspring of the War of the Roses, right? The War of the Roses being that kind of like early Renaissance war that occurred between the House of Lancaster and the House of York, and it would eventually end due to the fact that a House of Lancaster member and a House of York member would be married, and then their child and offspring would actually be the leaders of England, hence the Tudor Dynasty, right? So the Tudor Dynasty, of course, starts as a post-product of the War of the Roses, right? Now, Henry VIII, as we also know, where we like kind of left off in class, was known as the Defender of the Faith, right? The Defender of the Faith being, of course, this title that was bestowed upon Henry because he wrote a very famous book called In Defense of the Seven Sacred Sacraments, right? Where he actually said that, like, basically it was a rebuttal against Martin Luther, right? It's a rebuttal against Martin Luther and the ideas of a Protestant Reformation occurring in the continent of Europe, right? But then, ironically enough, just 9 years later, Henry VIII divorces himself, look at this goofy-looking dude, divorces himself from the Roman Catholic Church and creates the Church of England, a.k.a. the Anglican Church, right? Why is it called Anglican Church? A lot of it has to do with the medieval foundings of the medieval foundings of England, right? England was originally settled by the Angles, right? Angles. It was settled by the Angles, and then the Saxons came, and then they created the Anglo-Saxons. And then eventually, when the combination of French and Anglish, right? Anglish, A-N-G-L-E, or A-N-G-L-I-S-H, merged together, colloquially what would happen is there's an amorphism of the word and it would turn into English instead of Anglish, right? And so also the land of the Angles became England instead of Engleland, right? So anyway, but Church of England, of course, relates back to those medieval roots, right? And it's going to be established in 1530. Now, many are going to oppose this, right? This is not going to be a seamless transition. It's not going to be quick and easy. A lot of people are going to put a front to this, right? And one of them being Sir Thomas More, our writer of the Utopia, the man who never stopped being Catholic. He's going to decide that he is going to become Henry's chancellor. He was his main advisor, and due to the fact that he protested against the creation of the Church of England, he would be charged with treason. He also protests the idea that he of getting his marriage annulled, but he protested against it, and he ends up losing his noggin, right? So he ends up being executed, right? Now that Henry, though, has executed Sir Thomas More, and now that he can now successfully declare himself the leader of the Church of England, he literally did that. Jot that down. He declared himself the supreme leader of the Church of England and the head of the church itself. So he basically took the government and the Church of England and did the exact opposite thing that the Anabaptists wanted to do and combined the two of them together, right? Declaring himself the supreme leader of the church and also the supreme leader of the state, right? So Henry then is going to annul his marriage to his first wife, which is right here, and that is Catherine of Aragon, right? Catherine of Aragon being the aunt of Charles VIII, right? We got another little interrelationship between the Habsburgs and the Tudors and the Valois and the blah blahs. Now, all these other folks. Now, but anyway, to keep rolling forward, Henry annuls this marriage to Catherine, and they only successfully had one child, right? And that child's name was Mary, right? Mary Tudor, product of the marriage with Catherine of Aragon and Henry, right? She had several different stillbirths, though, and also had a lot of complications, like, of course, actually trying to have children. But he not only annuls this, relationship with her, but Catherine of Aragon, who is the aunt to Charles V, who is a devout Catholic himself and fights the Schmalkaldic Wars against the German princes and all the Lutherans. She never stops being Catholic. This is important to remember. And she is banished out of London and sent to a small corner of England where she would have to live out her days basically under house arrest until she died. And the person that went with her was her daughter. Mary was there. Mary was there watching her mother suffer in house arrest anguish while her father was off now marrying other people to try and have more children. So, of course, just a little spoiler alert, Mary is never also going to stop being Catholic. And she's going to be a fiery, intense Catholic at that, right? Fiery. You're going to understand what I mean by that later on. But Anne, though, is who he's going to marry. And her name is Anne Boleyn, right? Anne Boleyn, B-O-L-E-Y-N, who is the daughter of a English noble family and was one of Catherine of Aragon's ladies-in-waiting, right? She supported the move to actually create the Church of England and separate themselves from Catholic Italy. But she is going to, of course, again, also only give birth to a girl, right? She ends up having a girl, and that girl's name is Elizabeth I, right? Elizabeth I becomes later on the Iron Queen of England, right? And actually becomes a major leader. But Elizabeth I is Henry's second child with Anne Boleyn, right? Now, later on, because she has difficulty producing a male heir, and because she has stillbirth after stillbirth, and because she can't seem to figure out any type of way to carry a son for Henry, even though, ironically enough, we talked about this in class, it has nothing to do with her, it has everything to do with him and his weak genetic material, she is going to be charged with a series of charges because she refuses to annul the marriage with Henry, right? Henry approaches Anne and says, we're going to get this annulled too, and I'm going to go get off and get another wife. And she says, no, we're not. I'm going to stay with you, and we're going to keep trying to figure this out because she did not want to relinquish her power as the Queen of England, right? Now, Anne, though, however, is going to be charged with incest, of sleeping with her brother, of also treason, of trying to plot to kill the King of England and install her incestuous relationship with her brother on the throne, and she would actually be beheaded. And another fun fact, too, in the very first body part we get to add to our list, which is going to be drawn on the board, we're going to have our famous body parts list going now, is apparently her heart was also removed, right? When they actually killed her, executed her, and then would go off to bury her later on, her heart was removed, and apparently Henry kept it on his person almost at all times. Not on his person, he didn't carry it around or anything, but apparently it was either cremated or it was given to Henry kind of as a, token of their marriage, right? So, but they had one child, right? Elizabeth. And then Henry went off. Now he's got one wife under house arrest and another wife that's now dead. So now he has to go and find another wife. And the one he chooses is Jane Seymour. There was a couple of different women in the running, but Jane Seymour is the one that probably just inflated his ego the most. Because you got to remember, Henry is a big fan of Henry, right? Henry is all about Henry. Henry loves himself. He loves how masculine he is. And even though he lost a wrestling match to Francis I, which is hilarious, he ends up going off and finding a different wife, and that woman's going to be Jane Seymour. Now, Jane Seymour, though, also gets pregnant, and you can see her right there, right? Jane Seymour also gets pregnant and actually gives birth to a boy. Who would have thought? All right, so now, because a lot of people that have studied European history or think they have studied European history are always like, oh, isn't that the guy that never could have a son? He actually did have a son. His third surviving child was a son, right? And again, Jane Seymour, several miscarriages, several deaths at birth, right? But this one was even worse because she died in childbirth, right? Giving birth to his essence, his male heir, his daddy's little boy, the person he wanted to be with and wanted to share his rulingship with forever. But here's the problem with Edward. Edward was born a very sickly child, right? Let's look at the picture of Edward VI real quick before we go any further. Edward VI looks not too good. Edward VI is very sickly, thin, frail, and got several different illnesses following right after his youth. So just keep him in the back of your mind, though, right? Because are we still talking about Henry? Yes. We're not going to just leave Henry in the dust because he is a monumental figure that he still needs to understand and be able to wrap your mind around, right? So after Jane Seymour dies in childbirth, he then goes off to apparently marry this woman named Anne of Cleves, right? Now, Anne of Cleves is actually, Anne of Cleves is actually listed right there. That is Anne of Cleves, right? Anne of Cleves is right here. Jane Seymour is the only wives that I haven't pictured. Now, Anne of Cleves is an interesting one, though, because apparently Anne of Cleves was dished to him by his whatchamacallit. Henry went on to have 3 more wives, right? So this one's a big one. The guy that he creates as the archbishop of his new Church of England is a dude by the name of Thomas Cromwell, right? So Thomas Cromwell is going to be this dude that apparently introduces the idea of Anne of Cleves, because Anne of Cleves is not English. It was going to be the first wife that Henry marries that is going to be actually of German descent, right? And Anne of Cleves was introduced based off of I believe it's a Peter Bruegel painting, right? And this painting was shown to Henry, and Thomas Cromwell, his main assistant, following the death of Thomas More, is going to be like, hey, Henry, check her out. This is like pre-Victorian era Tinder, right? Like, so he's just like, check her out. You know, swipe right on that, right? And Henry decides, like, yeah, you know what? She is good looking. I heard she's beautiful. I will totally go talk to her and try to woo her using my masculinity, right? And so Henry goes off to meet Anne of Cleves, apparently, and when they actually met each other, the craziest thing happens. What ends up happening is he dresses like a servant, right? He dresses like a servant, and he dresses not like a king because he wants it to be love at first sight, right? He wants to be just in servant garb and not actually be dressed as a king. He wants her to meet eyes with him and be like, wow, that servant right there, that's the man of my dreams. And then he would be like, oh, but I'm the king, right? And it was going to be like a crappy rom-com movie. It's going to be like Princess Diaries, but in reverse, right? But when they got there to meet each other, apparently what actually happened is Anne of Cleves scoffed him off, thinking he was a servant, and apparently Henry VIII was never able to recover because of this hit to his masculinity. They did apparently get married, but it was for a very short amount of time, and Henry argues that they never consummated the marriage because he wasn't attracted to her and all this other stuff. He was like, her breath stinks and she's ugly and I hate her, but I think his masculinity was just bruised the entire time. And because Sir Thomas Cromwell is the guy that's going to suggest Anne of Cleves to Henry VIII, Thomas Cromwell ends up dead as well. Ends up actually being executed. His head is removed because he suggested a woman that Henry absolutely hated, right? And then he goes off to get married to Catherine Howard, and Catherine Howard is going to be executed because she's going to cheat on him with one of his main courtiers, right? One of his assistants in his court, man. Like, dude, nobody. Henry, good Lord, Henry. Like, you got to pick some different folks, right? You got to pick some different people to help you out. So Catherine Howard ends up dead because she cheats on him, has an affair with his courtier behind his back. And then he finally marries his 6th wife, Catherine Parr, and Catherine Parr is the only one that survives, right? Who actually lives past his age, okay? And so the whole train goes, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, right? So divorced, the first one to start the Church of England, beheaded because apparently she had an affair with her brother, but more than likely because she just couldn't have a son. Died because Jane Seymour died in childbirth. Divorced because he was like, I think she's ugly, when actually she just didn't notice you. Come on, you tool, right? So, and then beheaded because she cheated on him, and then survived, right? Catherine Parr being apparently the one that survives. And a lot of Catherines, too. Catherine of Aragon, and then it was Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, Catherine Parr, right? So, big thing, though, is now you know all the wives, and you know the story and the legend of, like, you know, Henry VIII, and, like, where all his wives came from, blah, blah, blah. But an important thing to get out of that entire spiel is the fact that he did have a son, right? So, the journey was pretty much done after Jane Seymour. He just wanted a ruling queen to be there by his side. And, of course, he went through other trials and tribulations, and he thought one was gross looking, but that's actually, I think, again, not true. But anyway, Anglicans, right? The Anglican Church. Now we got to talk about it itself, right? So what I want you to go ahead and jot down, and as a title above this, and just put the Anglican Church, or ideas of the Anglican Church, or properties of the Anglican Church, right? Because the Anglican Church is important to understand, because it's basically being like Diet Catholic, right? So the Anglican Church is going to retain most Catholic rituals, right? Like confession, celibacy for priests, transubstantiation rituals, blessing of the Eucharist, the importance of priests and clergymen early on. This will change as time progresses, but apparently, there we go. But apparently, the big thing about it, that's Thomas Cromwell right there. Henry later on, though, is going to begin to alter some things, right? For example, he begins to lash out against the concepts of monasteries, right? So Anglican did keep a lot of stuff. The Anglican faith kept, again, like I said, transubstantiation, celibacy in the Anglican Church, which is going to be a big thing. But going forward, he is then going to lash out against the concept of monasteries. And the reason why he does this is, again, because he wants more power, right? He looks at the monasteries as church-driven land, right? Monasteries, of course, belonging to former Catholic monks. And he's like, look at all of the land that these things sit on. It's close to 10% of the land of England belongs to all these monasteries. So he decides that he is going to destroy the monasteries and get rid of monks altogether in the Anglican Church so he can sell off that land, strip the wealth of land, and actually grow his power and influence by giving some of that land to nobles who he believes will now suck up to him, right? And so that's the big thing. And what does he turn into those things? This is very important. He strips the land for the enclosure movement, right? So enclosures is important. Underline it, highlight it, circle it. It's very important. We bring it up later, okay? But the enclosure movement is basically trying to move away from the idea of like the traditional farming, right? It's called the open field system, where nobles would like rent strips of land, and the enclosure movement was telling nobles to fence this land off and make it small, like larger units of fenced off land, so one servant family or serf family would work one area, making more gains and financial gains out of each strip of land, right? Which actually reduced the number of people needed for land, which is going to increase the number of people moving to cities in a process called urbanization, right? So we don't need to know about that a ton right now, but we do also need to know who this cat is, right? Sir Thomas Cromwell, right? Sir Thomas Cromwell was his chief minister. Okay, he pushes a ton of these reforms through. He cancels the monks. He cancels the idea of the Catholic Church coming in. He cancels the ideas of monasteries being a thing. And that, like, as his chief minister, he pushes a ton of these reforms. Even though in the long run he ends up being executed because he suggested Anna Cleves be his next wife, right? So basically just about every single, like, every single assistant or every single main advisor to Henry ends up losing their noggin. Ends up about like 6 inches short, right? And also during Henry's time, you have to understand, he's not a good guy. He's not like a nice ruler. He's very aggressive. He's stripping church land for financial gain. He's basically creating the Anglican Church just to grow his power. He's a total tool bag. He's obviously very disgusting to women. And also, he took over Ireland, right? Because they refused to change, okay? Ireland remained devoutly Catholic, right? And many of their properties were stripped and sold because he went into Ireland in, I believe, 1547 and took over Ireland and brought it inside of the English, holdings, right? So England would actually be holding England, Scotland, and Ireland in this idea that you would call Great Britain, or in this United Kingdom concept, right? But it wasn't called the United Kingdom quite yet. When did Henry take over Ireland? If I'm right with 1547, I'm freaking out. When did Henry, Ireland, Tudor conquest of Ireland? So close. 1542. 1542, he is declared the leader and the king of Ireland as well. So that's a big thing. Henry VIII also started the subjugation of the Irish people by the English. Hooray! Which is a big reason why some of you are actually, like, your families are here, which is really important. Actually, well, that might also be related to the potato famine and the Great Migrations, but still. Now, some small rebellions, though, in Ireland are going to be breaking up. And what ends up happening, though, is the Irish refuse to change to Anglican. They start going to Anglican masses and they start following Anglican rules, but they turn into what's known as like an at-home Catholic, right? They had small altars and stuff within their homes, especially in Ireland, and a lot of them refused to actually become truly Anglican. They just kind of pretended like they were becoming Anglican. Some small rebellions against the shift are going to rise up, but were very, very quickly suppressed, right? One huge rebellion was actually called the Pilgrimage of Grace, where some people were actually half-hung, is what it's called, right? Where they literally would be on these ladders and they would tie ropes to these people's necks as a punishment for these Irish that tried this Pilgrimage of Grace, and they actually would basically be choked out till nearly the point of death to punish them for trying to remain Catholic, right? Which is absolutely insane, okay? But what's going to happen is Henry is going to die eventually, right? And when Henry dies, right, Henry VIII dies, let's go ahead and get this date, because I'm missing some dates, which it looks like, okay? We need to jot this down real quick. Henry VIII died in 1547. That's what it was, all right? Henry VIII died in 1547, right? And in 1547, he left his son, Edward VI, on the throne, right? So in 1547, the rule of the Tudors is going to pass to his son, right? Edward VI. And Edward VI, though, is unfortunately only going to rule for about, give or take, 6-ish years, right? Because he ends up dying at the age of 15. And it really is more like 2 years if you count all the times that he was sick, right? Because again, look at it. Edward VI is a very frail kid. Following the death of his father in 1547, and after his father successfully put to death, I don't know, we just listed 4 people, but we could keep going up towards 5, right? So, because I think Sir Thomas Cromwell was also, it's a lot of, there's Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell, and then Thomas Cromwell, and I think he put all of them to death. I know Cromwell and More were definitely put to death, but I can't remember if Cromwell was actually put to death as well. But anyway, really, if you count Edward's rulings, he was really only actually in power for 2 years, right? Because he was ill so many times. And some really, really important facts about Edward is apparently when he was when he was really young, 4, he almost married a 7-month-old, right? So, a 7-month-old girl by the name of Mary, Queen of Scots, right? Which I need you to do me a favor, write her name down next to that 7-month-old, because it is important, okay? He also apparently at one point tried to give the throne to Lady Jane Grey, which is their cousin, which we'll talk about that later on as well, okay? So you guys asked if this flip was going to be short. We're actually pretty much almost done. All right, so because I just wanted to get through the Henry reign, right? Because look, down here, we don't have that much to go, and most of this other stuff is just pictures anyway, right? We got to talk about the birth of Calvinism next week, and then we got to talk about one other thing, and then we're going to review, and we're going to take the next test, right? But the big thing we are going to pick up on is Edward VI when we get back into class, right? Because we got to talk about this 7-month-old, who she is, right? Which is Mary, Queen of Scots. We got to talk about Lady Jane Grey, which is really, really important as well, which is his cousin that he tries to give the throne to. And we also got to talk about the Book of Common Prayer that he created, which is actually supposed to be the guiding text of Anglicans, which is going to be a really, really gross thing that ends up leading to a lot of rebellions later on as well, right? So, also jot that down because something very important is going to be the Third Secession Act that comes into Parliament in 1543, 4 years before the death of his father, which is going to legally end up giving the throne to Mary, even though her own dad made her a bastard. Now, anyway, so what? Bloody Mary, yeah.
Queen of Scots.
What? Huh?
Queen of Scots.
Well, that just means, he declared her that, because that'd be she's we weren't married when she had her, she's not
That's
a kid
when
anymore.
Jaden yelled out in class.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm a-
Okay, yeah, okay. Bye! All right.